The marble columns of the Supreme Court glistened under the afternoon sun, a symbol of order and restraint. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Cameras buzzed, journalists leaned forward in their seats, and the crowd whispered anxiously. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a routine public hearing. It was the moment Chief Justice John Roberts, the steady face of judicial authority, would try to put Donald Trump in his place. Roberts adjusted his glasses, his voice firm but measured as he looked across the hall at the former president. "Mr. Trump," he began, "the integrity of our institutions demands respect, not political spectacle. This is not a rally stage. It is a forum for serious constitutional discussion. I urge you to conduct yourself accordingly." The room hushed instantly. Even Trump's supporters, scattered across the audience, shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't every day the Chief Justice spoke so directly, so dismissively, to a former president. Roberts' tone carried not just authority, but also a sharp edge of condescension, as though reminding Trump that here, in this chamber, the rules were not his to bend. For a moment, Trump said nothing. He sat still, hands folded, his eyes narrowing as the cameras zoomed in. The tension was thick, the silence heavy, as if the entire country was leaning in to see whether Trump would yield or strike back. Then, with a slow smile, Trump rose to his feet. He didn't look rattled, he looked energized. He stepped toward the microphone, his signature presence filling the room before he even spoke. "John," Trump began, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the chamber, "I've stood on stages bigger than this one, with millions of people chanting my name. And let me tell you, no judge, no gavel, no robe has ever silenced the American people. And they won't start today." The audience gasped, half in shock, half in exhilaration. Trump had turned the Chief Justice's rebuke into a rallying cry, flipping the power dynamic in a single stroke. The chamber rippled with murmurs. Roberts' face tightened, the faintest sign that Trump's words had struck deeper than he wanted to admit. The Chief Justice adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and attempted to reassert control. "This is not a campaign arena, Mr. Trump," Roberts said firmly, his gavel striking the desk with a sharp crack. "We are here to examine matters of law, not indulge in theatrics. If you cannot respect the rules of this institution, then you risk undermining the very Constitution you claim to defend." Gasps and nods spread through the audience. The tension was thick, layered with both admiration for Roberts' composure and anticipation of Trump's inevitable reply. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, headlines already forming, "Chief Justice scolds Trump in public showdown." But Trump didn't look chastised. He leaned casually against the podium, his expression almost playful. Then, lowering his voice for dramatic effect, he asked a question that sliced through the room like a blade. "Tell me, John, where was this concern for the Constitution when politicians locked down small businesses, silenced churches, and destroyed livelihoods with the stroke of a pen? Where was this defense of law when activist judges rewrote legislation from the bench? You call this theatrics. I call it standing up for the people who've been ignored." The crowd erupted, half with applause, half with indignant boos. The air seemed to crackle as Trump turned what should have been a rebuke into an indictment of the very system Roberts represented. Roberts raised his gavel again, but his hand trembled ever so slightly. For years he had been seen as the voice of calm neutrality, the arbiter above politics. Yet now, under the spotlight and Trump's relentless gaze, even his authority looked fragile. Trump leaned forward, his voice rising like a storm. "The Constitution doesn't belong to judges in robes. It belongs to the American people. And I'll never apologize for reminding them of that." The hall exploded in cheers, the balance of power visibly shifting. The Supreme Court chamber had turned into something it was never meant to be, an arena. On one side stood John Roberts, calm yet visibly rattled, a man trying to defend the dignity of his institution. On the other, Donald Trump, unshaken and emboldened, wielding words like weapons. Roberts attempted to cut through the noise. His voice, deliberate and grave, echoed across the marble walls. "Mr. Trump, you risk turning this chamber into a spectacle. The people expect stability, not division. They look to us for balance, not battle." But Trump didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, almost amused, as though Robert's words only confirmed his point. Then, with a sharp turn toward the cameras, Trump seized the moment. "Division?" Trump asked, his tone dripping with incredulity. "Let me tell you something, John. Division didn't start with me. It started when the people in power, judges, politicians, so-called experts, stopped listening to Americans who work hard, pay taxes, and love their country. They divided us the moment they forgot who they serve." A wave of applause rolled through the audience, louder than before, drowning out the few scattered boos. Reporters typed furiously, realizing they were watching a confrontation that would dominate headlines for weeks. Robert's jaw tightened. He tried to strike back, but Trump's momentum was overwhelming. Trump gestured broadly toward the Chief Justice, his voice rising with every word. "You talk about stability, John. Stability for who? The elites in Washington? The bureaucrats who write rules nobody voted for? The Constitution wasn't written to protect them, it was written to protect us. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you're in the wrong place." The audience gasped. Even some legal scholars in the front row exchanged uneasy glances. Trump had done the unthinkable, he had flipped the courtroom dynamic, making Roberts appear as though he was the one on trial. The camera zoomed in on Roberts' face, stern, but undeniably shaken. Trump leaned back slightly, letting his words hang in the air like a verdict. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, as if the very air had been pulled from the room. Every word Trump had spoken echoed in the minds of those present, shifting the ground beneath the Chief Justice's feet. Roberts straightened his shoulders, clinging to the authority that had defined his career. "Mr. Trump," Roberts said sharply, his tone carrying the weight of the gavel in his hand. "This is not a campaign stage. This is a court of law. If you continue down this path, you risk doing irreparable harm to the very democracy you claim to defend." Trump didn't move at first. He let the words hang there, savoring the tension, his eyes locked on Roberts like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then he stepped forward, gripping the podium with both hands, and unleashed his reply. "Irreparable harm? Let me tell you about irreparable harm," Trump thundered, his voice reverberating against the marble walls. "Irreparable harm is when families lose their businesses because bureaucrats in Washington shut them down. Irreparable harm is when judges twist the Constitution to fit an agenda. Irreparable harm is when the American people are silenced while elites pat themselves on the back." A roar erupted from the audience, drowning out the faint cries of protest. Trump's words struck like lightning, igniting both cheers and outrage. Reporters captured every gesture, every inflection, knowing history was being written in real time. Roberts, visibly unsettled now, slammed his gavel again. "Order. This is not acceptable." But Trump leaned back, his expression calm, almost amused. "Order? The American people don't want order if it means being ignored. They want a voice. And that voice will never be silenced, not by politicians, not by media, not even by a Chief Justice." The chamber shook with energy, a mix of chaos and conviction. For the first time, it felt less like a courtroom and more like a battlefield, and Trump was clearly in command. By now, the scene no longer resembled a solemn judicial chamber. It had transformed into a stage where two titans clashed, one cloaked in the authority of the judiciary, the other wielding the raw force of political will. Every eye was locked on them, the tension mounting with every exchange. Roberts tried to seize back the narrative. His voice, deliberate and edged with frustration, echoed, "Mr. Trump, this institution has endured for centuries because it is rooted in respect for the rule of law. No individual, not even a president, stands above it. You cannot turn this court into a platform for populist spectacle." Trump let the words sink in, then slowly shook his head. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Respect for the rule of law. John, I agree, but let's be honest. Too many in power have used those same words to cover up their failures. Respect doesn't mean silence. Respect doesn't mean bowing to unelected elites who think they're untouchable. Respect means accountability, and right now, the American people are holding this entire system accountable. The chamber erupted once more. Supporters cheered, fists raised in approval, while critics shouted in protest. The divide was sharper than ever, yet Trump seemed to thrive on it, feeding off the energy in the room. Roberts, gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles whitened, tried one last attempt at control. If this continues, you risk destabilizing the very democracy you claim to protect. Trump leaned forward, eyes blazing with conviction. Democracy doesn't die because a politician raises his voice. Democracy dies when leaders stop listening to their people. And John, I'll tell you right now, I'll never stop listening. The explosion of cheers that followed was deafening, drowning out even the sharp crack of Robert's gavel. Cameras flashed, pens raced across notepads, and everyone present realized they were witnessing something more than a courtroom debate. It was a collision of power, and Trump had seized the upper hand. The weight of history pressed against the marble walls, yet the chamber felt alive with raw, unfiltered energy. Trump had shifted the ground beneath Roberts, and everyone knew it. The Chief Justice, normally the embodiment of composure, now showed faint cracks, a flash of irritation in his eyes, the way his gavel struck harder than necessary. Mr. Trump, Roberts declared, his tone sharpened by exasperation, our democracy relies on restraint. It relies on leaders who respect limits, even when they disagree. If you cannot respect those limits, you risk dismantling the very foundation of this nation. The statement echoed like a final warning. Some in the audience leaned forward, expecting Roberts' words to carry the authority to end the confrontation. But Trump only smiled, not the grin of a man cornered, but of one who saw the perfect opening. Limits? Trump repeated, his voice rising like thunder. You mean the limits placed on the American people when unelected officials tell them what they can say, what they can believe, and how they can live? You mean the limits that suffocate workers, farmers, soldiers, and families while Washington elites lecture them from marble halls? That's not democracy. That's control. A massive cheer erupted, reverberating off the walls. Trump had transformed Roberts' words into fuel for his own cause, leaving the Chief Justice standing on thinner and thinner ice. Trump pressed forward, his tone sharp yet deliberate. Democracy doesn't crumble when leaders speak out. It crumbles when those in power silence dissent. And let me be very clear, I will not be silenced. Not by politicians, not by the media, not by you, John. The audience gasped at the directness of the attack. Even seasoned journalists, used to Trump's confrontational style, exchanged stunned glances. Roberts froze, gripping the gavel tighter, his authority visibly slipping away with every second. In that moment, the chamber no longer looked like the Supreme Court. It looked like Trump's stage, and Roberts, for the first time, seemed like the man on trial. The gallery was buzzing, a mix of outrage, disbelief, and uncontainable excitement. Cameras clicked non-stop, capturing every flicker of expression between the Chief Justice and the former president. The atmosphere was no longer one of order, it was a showdown, raw and unfiltered. Roberts raised his gavel again, his voice carrying a rare edge of frustration. Mr. Trump, this is a court of law, not a rally. If you continue to disregard decorum, you risk dragging this institution into chaos. And chaos, Mr. Trump, is not leadership. Trump leaned forward, both hands gripping the podium, his eyes locked on Roberts with an intensity that silenced even the loudest critics in the room. Chaos? John, let me tell you something. What you call chaos, the American people call courage. It's courage to stand up when the system is broken. It's courage to fight when the so-called guardians of democracy refuse to do their job. And it's courage to say out loud what everyone else is too afraid to admit: the people are being betrayed by the very institutions meant to protect them. The chamber erupted into thunderous applause, overpowering the faint cries of protest. Some in the crowd stood to their feet, waving small flags they had smuggled in, as if they were no longer in the Supreme Court but in the middle of a political battlefield. Roberts tried to strike back. And what happens when every man decides his own version of the law? That isn't democracy, Mr. Trump. That is anarchy. Trump's grin widened. He delivered his words slowly, like a verdict. No, John. Anarchy is when unelected judges rewrite the Constitution from the bench. Anarchy is when bureaucrats dictate to the people instead of serving them. What I'm doing here isn't anarchy. It's accountability. And accountability terrifies the powerful. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Even Roberts' allies in the audience shifted uneasily. Trump had turned the Chief Justice's accusation into a rallying cry, and the crowd was with him. The chamber felt like it was vibrating with every cheer, every gasp, every crack of Roberts' gavel. What was supposed to be a calm proceeding had turned into a national spectacle, and Trump thrived in the chaos. Roberts, his patience thinning, tried again to anchor the moment with solemnity. Mr. Trump, leadership requires discipline. It requires restraint. Without those qualities, even the strongest nations falter. You speak of accountability, but accountability without order is nothing more than noise. Trump smirked, letting the Chief Justice's words settle before delivering his counterpunch. His voice, steady and commanding, rolled across the chamber. Noise? You call the voices of millions of Americans noise? You call their frustration, their pain, their cries for justice noise? John, what you hear as noise, I hear as the heartbeat of this nation. And I will never apologize for amplifying it. The crowd erupted again, louder this time, stomping feet echoing like thunder. Roberts slammed his gavel so hard it nearly splintered against the bench. This court will not be turned into a circus, he barked, but his words were drowned by the roars of the audience. Trump raised a hand, and the chamber quieted almost instantly. The contrast was stark: Roberts, the figure of official authority, powerless against the control Trump held over the crowd. Let me remind you, John, Trump continued, his tone dropping lower, more personal, the Constitution wasn't written to protect institutions from the people. It was written to protect the people from institutions. And if standing here and speaking truth makes this chamber a circus, then maybe the circus is what America needs to wake up. The words landed like a hammer blow. The camera zoomed in, capturing Roberts' clenched jaw and Trump's unwavering stance. In that instant, the roles had shifted completely. Roberts no longer looked like the arbiter of justice, he looked like the man being judged. By now, the chamber was more alive than anyone could remember. This wasn't just a clash of words, it was a collision of two visions for America, one rooted in institutional order, the other in populist fire. The camera zoomed closer, sensing the moment was spiraling into history. Roberts steadied himself, his voice dropping into a grave, almost pleading register. Mr. Trump, history will judge what happens here today. Will it remember you as a man who defended the Constitution, or as one who trampled it for applause? The question was sharp, designed to corner him. For a fleeting second, the audience leaned in, wondering if Trump would hesitate. But instead, he leaned into the podium, his voice calm, precise, and devastating. History, John, doesn't remember the men who kept their heads down and followed the rules. It remembers the ones who stood when everyone else stayed silent. It remembers the leaders who fought for the people, even when the institutions called them reckless. And I'll tell you this, I'd rather be remembered as the man who shook the system than the one who bowed to it. The crowd roared so loudly that the marble seemed to tremble. Supporters rose to their feet, chanting his name. Even some who had entered the chamber skeptical couldn't deny the sheer force of his conviction. Roberts, visibly rattled, tried to hold his ground. You risk undermining the very balance that makes this nation strong. Trump's response came like a hammer: balance? You call it balance when unelected judges make decisions that strip power from the people who built this country? That's not balance, John, that's betrayal. And betrayal has no place in a democracy. The applause was thunderous, drowning Roberts entirely. For the first time, it was clear, this wasn't Roberts' chamber anymore. It was Trump's arena, and the verdict was already written in the faces of the crowd. The tension had reached its peak. Every word spoken echoed far beyond the marble walls, carried instantly to millions watching across the nation. This was no longer a dispute between two men, it was a symbolic clash between authority and defiance, order and rebellion. Roberts sat rigidly, his face lined with frustration and disbelief. The gavel, once a symbol of absolute control, now looked powerless in his grip. He raised it high, as if striking it could restore order. Enough, he declared, his voice strained but still authoritative. This institution will not be hijacked by spectacle. I demand silence. But the silence never came. The crowd, emboldened by Trump's defiance, erupted into chants. USA! 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 The sound reverberated like a storm, drowning out the Chief Justice himself. Trump stood tall, letting the chants build before raising his hand again. Like a conductor before an orchestra, he commanded the noise to stillness. And then, in that pin-drop moment, he delivered his final blow. John, the people aren't afraid of noise. They're afraid of silence, the silence of leaders who ignore them, the silence of courts that forget them, the silence of a system that values power over truth. I will never contribute to that silence. Not today, not ever. The chamber shook with applause so overwhelming that even the press pool momentarily forgot to take notes. Cameras flashed, capturing Roberts' frozen expression, the Chief Justice who had tried to silence a man, only to be drowned out by the roar of the people. Trump turned slightly toward the audience, his voice calm but ringing with finality. This fight isn't about one man or one institution. It's about a nation that refuses to be muted. And as long as I have breath in my body, the American people will never be silenced. The chants surged back, louder than ever. Roberts' gavel fell once more, but no one heard it. The verdict had already been delivered, not by the bench, but by the crowd. Trump walked away from the podium, head held high, as if he had already written the headline himself. And perhaps he had.